God breaking through to our eyes, but this is no great surprise. Babies in barns, green fields of farms, this is the body of God. A star in the dark sky we share, straw underfoot as we look up and stare. Each part of creation, a perfect formation that lives as the body of God. Where else would God be but right here? In, within, through all we sense and we feel. God in the manger, God in the cows, God in the innkeeper's mother's eyebrows. Sure was a marvelous night, the story of birth and new life, and the dreams and the fears of the new parents' prayers were felt in the body of God. Just one more beautiful way God's body blooms its array. Our Christmas story, one image of glory as we move in the body of God. Where else would God be but right here? Transcendent and cosmic and at home in our tears. God in the common, God in the strange, God in Jesus' very first diaper change. Well, these are unsettling times, and as I put my son down for the night, I can't help to dream how much kinder we'd be if we knew all of life, the world's every plight, to be part of the body of God. Well, where else would God be but right here? Under our noses and in the midst of our fears. God in our stories, God in the world, God in the pain and the good news we've heard. Oh, God in the manger, God in the cows, God in the common, God in the strange, God in our stories, God in the world, God in the pain and the good news we've heard. Oh,
well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Hope you're doing well. Welcome to our first really purely virtual evening programming at the First Presbyterian Church of Mahopac since it feels like the beginning of this last year when we sort of put a pause on midweek Vespers because it felt like at the time it met the need it was supposed to serve, and as we transitioned back into in-person worship, it felt like it opened up room for other things. And so as we head into Advent, I thought it would be interesting for us to go back to a more virtual format for our midweek program that was purely virtual. As you know, when we gather together on Sunday, if you're watching this at a later time, of course, we try to make our worship services hybrid or as inclusive as we can to people who are joining online. We know that's not always possible, though, and sometimes that's a difficult thing to do. So this is a really digital first program here at the First Presbyterian Church of Mahopac. Whether you're watching live right now or at a later time, as we begin a series of conversations that use the sort of Advent devotional book, A Weary World, Reflections for a Blue Christmas by Kathy Escobar. A really lovely book, and I think you'll see in a moment how that wonderful song that you may hear later on this season, once again, maybe Jim was alluding to that. I think it fits beautifully with the theme of what we are going to cover tonight in this first week of the book. Now, you don't have to buy the book. That's okay. I'm going to be hitting on some major themes that I think are relevant, even if you don't. But if you're looking perhaps for a different kind of Advent devotional this year, the Amazon link to the book or the ebook version, it's in the chat. And I hope that during this time, as we share, as we sort of cover some of what's in these reflections that she offers. If you're watching live, you can feel free to, now I'm going to point at the screen. I don't know which way I'm pointing to, but you see now if you're looking at the screen, there's the little chat box. So you'll see if you're from Facebook or YouTube. And perhaps you have a question or you have something you want to share, you can do it and it'll pop up right there and you can see it. I can see everything. And if you maybe have something later on after this stops being live, you are more than welcome to share something in the comments and I'll do my best to try and go back every week and look over those. But as we begin this as well, you'll see that if you are live, we do have some online interactive portions as well. It's not just always going to be me talking at you. Hopefully we can incorporate some fun interactive things as well. So I think, unless I'm missing anything, I believe that is really what I wanted to highlight before we begin our first week looking at this book by Kathy Escobar and really covering themes that I think are still very appropriate for us this year as we head into Advent, and knowing that even though things might feel like that they're getting on track or heading back towards normal, whatever normal was even before the pandemic, that even before then, we acknowledge that this time of year and even this season of Advent is not always the easiest, and perhaps opening the doorway to having some conversations about looking at Advent and Christmas through an authentic lens. So I think as we head into the evening, you see that you could still see the chat there, and I have some wonderful or we're going to have some slides for you as well here this evening. In case you've never used this before, there's going to be a couple opportunities here in the beginning where I'm just going to ask some questions as I talk. And if you're not watching this live, don't worry. Well, I guess you could pay attention to it for the next time if you want to join in live. But we're going to do some questions here at the top that if you would like to participate in using either the on-screen method you're going to see, or if you want to just type in the chat, you're more than welcome to do that. That's okay. But if you would like to use what you're seeing on your other screen right here where it talks about Menti, all you have to do is go to menti.com, and then you're going to enter in that little code 89907089, because we're going to have a couple whole conversation questions first here to sort of break the ice this evening. And if you don't feel like chatting in the chat box, that's fine also. You can answer these questions for yourselves at home. That's sort of the purpose of these conversations as well. And just in case as well, also can drop that into the chat, so you could just click on that if you're on Facebook or YouTube as well without typing anything in, and it'll open it up for you on your computer. So don't think it can get any more easier than that. But as we head into this evening, beginning these reflections, Kathy Escobar really lays out a lovely beginning portion for us to consider when we talk about Advent, I think. We talk about the Advent journey a lot, or you hear me talk at least about our Advent journey as we build up to the events of what happened on what we celebrate on Christmas Eve. And she talks, I think, really nicely in the introduction to her book. She talks about this friend she has who talks about the Advent season or the Christmas season being this time that either magnifies for people their joys or it magnifies for people their sorrow or whatever pain it is they're going through. And that's very true. And what I think is beautiful about that is because even if we do go into Advent in this Christmas season with a certain level of joy or a certain level of hope, there, I think, are always certainly going to be things that perhaps are always lying underneath the surface, things that perhaps still make the season difficult if we were to address these things. But because we're not good at talking about pain or grief or loss, we just try and bury it underneath. That being said, I want to just sort of start off with a softball question for you all, and you can feel free to participate virtually however much you want to. There's no pressure. But just how are you feeling this evening? If you were to sort of take a moment to pause and to take a centering breath, perhaps you close your eyes for a moment and just say a short prayer. How are you feeling? How are you feeling? Tired? I think there's a lot of people who feel tired. Anxious. Yeah, that's another one. Anxious. Perhaps you're feeling uncertain or worried. There's all these things that we can feel. And now I forget if the slide is going to talk about it later on. But I asked this question of how we're feeling because I want us to think about looking at Advent this season as saying that it's okay for us to say however it is we're feeling, and then that's it. I don't think we have to try and sugarcoat the way we feel. I think especially in a church setting, if we're talking about Sunday morning, or if we're talking about catching up with someone in the church parking lot, or even if you run into someone in the grocery store, right? You see a friend and you ask them how they're doing, and they might say, I don't know, maybe something's bothering them, but they say, oh, but it's fine, I'm good. And sometimes I think in our just sort of aversion, even in the Christian faith, our aversion to talking about things that are hard and difficult, we sort of close off those conversations, and we say, and we say, oh, like instead of leaving what I'm feeling out there in the open, I'm going to try and put a but, or I'm going to try and add something else to sort of minimize whatever pain or stress or whatever it is you're feeling. And I hope that as we go into this first section of her book that focuses on her Advent reflections, this first week, which focuses on honoring reality, that we might use the Christmas story, the Christmas narrative, to begin to think about how are ways that we can honor what it is we're all feeling during these times. Because we may not all be feeling joyful, or we may not all feel like singing the Christmas hymns. Perhaps for some, even as Kathy Escobar names in her book, perhaps even going through the Christmas traditions that we go through in our church, perhaps they just seem very disconnected from how we're feeling. And this goes into the first sort of quote I think is lovely in her book from Megan Devine, who says that some things just can't be fixed. Sometimes they can only be carried. And as we think about that in terms of Advent, it's sort of interesting for us to think about the fact that there are some things that can't be fixed, that they can only be carried, because there's not always going to be a solution, or an easy solution, at least, to a problem we're facing. And if we were to look at the Christmas story, certainly there were some things that just had to be carried. They couldn't just be fixed. I bring up this quote from that she also uses because it really relates to this other portion of her book that Kathy Escobar writes, where she says that we don't need to put a but at the end of each challenging thing we share. It's hard to just say I'm suffering without adding, oh, but I've got a lot to be thankful for. I find that to be really beautiful. I find that to be really impactful for what it means to be a person of faith during these holiday times, during these Advent times. What I think is important about this as we look at honoring reality this first week and its relationship to the Christmas story is that we can hold all these things together. That there are people who can, or, what I should say is that it's possible to hold all these things together without trying to minimize or maximize one or the other. That we can certainly say that we can go to church on Sunday and that we could sing the hymns that are familiar, Joy to the World, or O Come, Emmanuel, and find comfort in that, while at the same time also naming that there are things that, if you don't mind me saying, and I apologize, but if you don't mind me saying that there are just some things this season that just suck. And no matter what anyone tries to do, it just is there. Kathy Escobar in her books names for us some things that people are going through this season, or some ways in which the season is painful for us, where we've suffered losses. We've lost people, we've lost jobs, we lost dreams or faith communities. Perhaps we aren't where we wish we were in our lives. Perhaps we're just worn down and we're weary. Perhaps we feel alone. Perhaps we're in the middle of crisis. Perhaps our families are non-existent or tricky. Perhaps we feel disconnected and we feel confused in our faith. Perhaps we don't do well with the inauthenticity in this season of our story. Perhaps we're scared of hope. These are all things she names as realities. That's just really what they are. They're realities. That even if we feel like, or if we say we're doing fine, I'm sure that there are some ways in which we are struggling, or we know people who are struggling this winter, this Advent season. Even though she talks about hope as being this thing that can be fearful, I think Kathy Escobar would go on to say, especially as we talked about hope this last Sunday, which was the first Sunday of Advent, I think she might also say that there is hope in this journey of honoring our reality, our various realities. Because when we are able to authentically come together and name the things that make this season hard, or what make life hard, there's hope in that. There's hope in that because we realize then that we're just not the only ones who are going through something right now, and that there's more ways than one in which we can relate to the suffering and pains that are going on around us, and that we're not going through these things just by ourselves, even though in many ways it might feel like we are. And that's sort of where I think this tie-in she brings in with the Advent stories really appropriate, I think, or with the Christmas story at least, because I love this. I just love this. But before we sort of move into how she relates us all in this first week to honoring reality, I'm just curious, if you were to think for a moment, what is a word or a phrase you would use to describe the Christmas story? Let's say you're describing the Christmas story to someone else. I'm going to give you a moment to think about that as I take a sip of water here. How would you describe the Christmas story or the nativity scene to someone who maybe hadn't heard it before? I think we see the paintings of what the nativity looks like. Whether or not that's how we would describe it, that's another story. Just for a moment, though, how would you describe the Christmas story, the nativity scene, if we wanted to really focus in on that? I asked this question of how you would describe the Christmas story or the nativity scene because I think that impacts how we approach what goes on in this season of Advent or this season of Christmas, and how we relate to the things going on in our own lives and how we relate to the things going on in other people's lives. Yeah, I love the idea of family, of using that to describe the Christmas story. I ask it because in one of her towards the end of her week, because this book is divided into weeks, I bring up the Christmas story because we're going to get to that in a second here, because I think it does shape how we think about what's going on, especially in this sort of first question she asks, which is, what's happening in your world or the wider world that's making you feel weary right now. And I don't expect anyone to answer this publicly, but just think about it for a moment, to yourself at least. Think about what's making you weary. Maybe think about how the Christmas story or the birth of Christ, that nativity scene, might relate to what it is you're feeling right now. How it either helps or doesn't help you relate to your feeling weary right now. Just take a moment to reflect on that. And as you reflect on that, I asked this question before we get to sort of the main point for this evening, because Kathy Escobar also brings up then this passage from the Gospel of Mark, which sounds very familiar to the passage we read from Matthew's Gospel this past Sunday. And she highlights this phrase towards the end of Mark's reading, where it says, "And what I say to you, I say to all. Keep awake." It's interesting because to be quite honest, I've always thought of this phrase of keeping awake as being a very positive thing, right? Jesus asks his disciples to keep awake, asks us to be alert, to be awake, to watch out for what's going on in our lives and in our world. I never thought of it as the way Kathy Escobar describes, in which she describes this passage from Mark as relating to maybe not those ways I've always thought about this passage. In her book, she writes about how she views or how she relates to this passage of Mark after explaining some of the own trauma she's gone through in her family. But she says, for some, you're agonizingly awake to your story right now. It's keeping you up at night, doing a number on your head, your heart. For others, you're trying to tune it out, to numb it out, do whatever you can not to feel it. That's interesting, I think. And it's another way to interpret the Advent passages we read on Sunday morning, to be aware even for us of how other people might be listening to these Advent texts that we hear each week. Because it's a great example of how I have never really thought of this passage in a way that might highlight or emphasize whatever I'm going through in my life. But for someone like Kathy Escobar, or for someone else who's going through a series of pains or sufferings, that it's a reminder that for many, they are awake. And they're awake not for the reasons we think they are. For myself, it's a reminder then to keep a heart that's open, empathetic, a heart that acknowledges what's really going on around me. And this is, I think, where we sort of get to what's being talked about in her relationship of holding up this story of honoring reality with what's going on in these passages we love and we cherish, and we read them each Christmas year. This sort of broad second question she asks is talking about being honest about the Christmas story for you this season. What part of it do you like? What parts are comforting? What's annoying or what's hard to embrace? What I love about this is because she talks about in her book how we've sort of quote unquote sanitized the Christmas story. I don't want to harp on it again, but you all know how I feel about Hallmark movies. I think at this point I'm not the biggest fan. And so I apologize if you do. There's nothing wrong with Hallmark movies. They're just not my cup of coffee. But in many ways, we've almost turned the Christmas story into a Hallmark movie. We've sort of sanitized it. We've removed in our telling of the Christmas story. We've scrubbed out the real messiness, the pain, the parts that really are authentic, the parts that really are relatable to us right now as people who might be struggling, or as people who are wrestling with a lot of different things on our hearts. It's a reminder of the way in which the Christmas story was one that is very relatable for us here today, in a way that can help us reclaim our own realities. I find this picture she takes, this comic, she has this in her book. I find it very I find it a little amusing. She wants us to think about the real Advent story, who was there at the birth of Christ. And she highlights that it's not the glamorous Christmas story that we've always thought about. That if we really wanted to look at the Advent story, the Christmas story, it's not the kind that we'll find on a Christmas card. But we have these large group of people coming from foreign places. We don't know who they are. And they weren't necessarily the kings that we have now portrayed them to be. There were animals, and you see in the cartoon labels that, yes, they did have little droppings everywhere. There was straw there for the animals as feed, and even used for Jesus's bed. You had new parents who in reality were nobodies, as it says in the cartoon. People who were most likely like you and me. People who carried with them a lot of different things. And they found themselves in this unfolding narrative of God. And then you have those people who you don't often think about welcoming to the table. You have those people who you don't think about welcoming into church on Sunday morning for one reason or another. The unclean people, as it says in the cartoon, the shepherds. Because let's be real, they most likely weren't that. Well, it was a dirty profession, right? And the question is, where is all the important people? These are the ways in which Kathy Escobar, I think, wants us to think about the Christmas story, think about these sacred texts that we've held on to in relationship to how we're going to honor our own realities this Advent season. Because as I mentioned before, if we can cultivate a more authentic way to talk about it, I think it will help us begin to feel more open to sharing, to be more open in acknowledging the ways in which this season can be both joyous and also difficult. Because if we were to be honest and tell the real version of the Christmas story, it was not a silent night. I think we could say that childbirth back then, like it is today, was probably a messy affair. We could say that animals aren't always clean, especially if we're talking about the livestock who was there in Jesus' stall. For the newborn parents, for Mary, for Joseph, especially for Mary, that it's hard to breathe a sigh of relief with the powerful hunting you down. Mary, especially Mary, is someone who stands as this figure in Kathy Escobar's reflection, as this figure who is able to hold the joys, the sorrows, the complexities of life together, and helping us to understand how we can let go and how we can also say, I don't know. To say I don't know to some of the answers in life that we don't have answers to, and that's okay. Now, this one wasn't in Kathy Escobar's book, but when I think about the Advent scene today, or when I think about the Nativity scene today, I do also want to know what mother would want a drummer to greet their newborn child. Now, I know that's not in scripture either, but I always find it funny that we have this song, "No Little Drummer Boy," and I don't think Mary would have appreciated that. You know, if she finally got Jesus to sleep and then you have this drummer, yeah, I don't think it really fits into this whole portion of what Mary was really looking for at the time. I hope that as we're able to reflect this season on our Advent journey, as we build up eventually to the Christmas story, that we're able to begin to take a new look perhaps at rereading the stories we are most familiar with this time of year. And that perhaps we can look at them and be reminded of the hope that we find in them, the hope that we've heard preached or said or read in church for as long as time. But I would hope that we can go back and reread these passages of Scripture to also find the ways in which we could place ourselves in them today as people who are wrestling with so much, especially as we look back on the fact that there's so much that we've had to deal with this past year, this year, with employment or jobs or schools. There's a lot we've had to deal with. And to be able to take a moment this Advent season, this Christmas season, to name what those things are and to reclaim the Christmas story as one that can hold those realities together, I think that's a powerful thing. So perhaps go through till the next time we meet. Go back, reread some of those Christmas passages you're familiar with. Look for the ways in which perhaps, I don't remember seeing that in a TV remake of the Christmas story. Because I think we'd be surprised in the ways in which we have sort of cleaned up the Christmas story. Because it's a lot more complex, and I think it is a lot more accommodating to the multitude, the many facets of emotions that people are feeling, that you're feeling, that I'm feeling this time of year. So I hope that's something we can do. And I hope that we can create the spaces then to have conversations either with family or friends, to take a moment and just be honest with one another about honoring whatever our current realities are. Friends, as you know, before I started this series, I said that I wanted to keep them relatively short. One, because I found the last time I did these and I talked for more than half an hour, my voice went hoarse. So I think I'm going to try and keep them around this sort of time length. But before we close out this first session where we look at the first week of Kathy Escobar's book, I would like to just lead us in a word of prayer. So if you would, you can either join me in saying this prayer out loud for yourself, or you can close your eyes. But let us join together in prayer. God, help us live in the places that don't make sense. Help us keep hobbling through the hard. Help us remember that no matter how confused, how broken, how tired, or faithless we might feel, you are with us. And we are a part of your story. Amen. So friends, I hope you enjoyed this sort of short series, or this shorter first part of our series that's going to continue up through Advent. Next week, we're going to look at the second section of Kathy Escobar's book. And so I hope that you can join us next week, whether you were live here. It was great to see you, those folks who I saw in the chat, and those who I may see later on in the comment sections. So friends, I hope that you have a blessed night. And I hope that this season you are able to find whatever rest your heart needs, whatever your soul needs to feel like it's fed, or to take a moment to just breathe. So friends, until the next time we meet, may God be with you.